Postal worker spots stains on elderly woman, calls 911 after a shocking discovery inside. Ethan Harris, a young postman, never imagined when he rang the doorbell to deliver a box on his known path. Horror he would meet as the door cracked open, he came upon a dream Mrs. Robinson, once the image of suburban grace before him. Her silver hair was matted and oily, her garments soiled and hung loosely. She was in a state of startling neglect. Whole presence a shell of her former self as Mrs. Robinson shook violently. Ethan peeped inside her house and witnessed what made his blood freeze in. He knew he had to act before we dove in. That heart-stopping moment. Comment underneath where you are seeing or listening from today. Keep in mind whether you would enjoy this startling narrative, and don't forget. The pre-dawn silence was broken just as the sun had barely risen above the horizon by Ethan Harris's alarm clock. After years of the same, with practiced efficiency, he woke from his bed and moved automatically. He made his way to the bathroom, splashing water on his face. Routine, the chilly morning air nibbled at his skin to run away the last traces of sleep as he stood before the mirror. Ethan stopped to carefully adjust his postal uniform, smoothing out the creases on the blue cloth embroidered. For him, the recognizable eagle logo brought quiet pride since it symbolized more than just a career. Had a link to the neighborhood, he serviced grabbing a quick breakfast. Ethan left the house with a banana and a granola bar. The community of Copper Hill was not yet entirely peaceful. Awake, he inhaled deeply, appreciating the clean morning air flavored with the perfume of just mowed grass and early blossoming flowers as Darius neared the post. He nodded a greeting to his colleagues, passing quick pleasantries as they all got ready for the next day. He mentally checked his postal van's path after gathering his bag of mail and the keys. Day stepped into the van, Ethan's driver's seat, and he felt peace flood over him, this vehicle with its over the years. Familiar weathered steering wheels and the subtle scent of paper and ink had become second home to him. Began the engine in a soft rumble to accompany the symphony of the day. Deliveries as Ethan started his path. The town gradually came alive all around him. Early risers waved as they gathered their newspapers. Dog walkers grinned as they passed. The occasional jogger waved as well. Nodded in thanks for these brief exchanges since Ethan's backbone was built around them. Linked to Copper Hill, he proceeded with deliberate ease over the peaceful streets. His motions are well. Each halt in the coordinated dance of efficiency was a fleeting period in time, a letter. Handed over a gift and quickly exchanged a few words with a known face. However, for Ethan, these events were the threads woven through his daily life, each one special and worth in its own right. Mid-morning, Ethan stopped to go over his next round of deliveries and leaned against the side of his van, the metal cool against his back as he worked through small bundles and envelopes. The ritual was such, entrenched that his hands seemed to move of their own while sifting and arranging with unthinking accuracy. As he grabbed for the next packet, Mrs. noticed a name. Robinson Jane, a little smile pulled at his mouth, had been a. Long since he had seen the elderly woman, and the possibility of their future meeting injected a spark of excitement about his day, pushed Ethan's thoughts to earlier interactions with Mrs. Robinson. Recalled her friendly welcome, the way her eyes crinkled at the corners when she grinned, and her ways of. Mrs. Robinson was always seemed really engaged in his day in a job that could occasionally seem boring. Brilliant point of reference for the interpersonal relationships driving his art. Meaningful. With renewed energy, Ethan got back into his van and headed for Elm Street, Mrs. Robinson's house. Waiting as he traveled, he discovered he was looking forward their little conversation as a highlight in his otherwise. Ethan knew little about typical days. He was unaware that this stop would be starting a trip that would test his knowledge of his peaceful postal path, and Ethan pulled up to Mrs. Robinson's house and observed something. People he serviced noted. The usually well-kept front yard seems rather overgrown, with a few stray weeds peeping through. The flower gardens were a little element, but one that caught the attention of someone who had been visiting this land frequently. Ethan shook off the observe for years, then took the parcel and headed up the front road with concrete. Warm underfoot, the summer sun heated all morning as he walked toward the entrance. saw the heap of newspapers on the front step, some browning at the margins from Ethan's environmental exposure. Pushed the doorbell, its muted sound resonating throughout the house he was waiting for. Moving his weight from one foot to the other, he strains for any movement inside. Seconds passed as Ethan stretched into a full minute of silence, frowning slightly. This time, he tried once more with adding a few strong knocks to the door for good measure. Yet, there was no reaction, and a slight sense of unease started to slink through. Mrs. Robinson was often rather fast in responding to the door, always smiling warmly and with a. Her absence felt improper somehow, like a dissonant note in a familiar song. Melody moaning, Ethan grabbed his notepad and rapidly wrote a letter on the item he dropped into the mailbox. He now observed was completely filled with unopened mail. The sight simply added to his increasing. He turned to go, but Mrs. Robinson's next-door neighbor, Mr. Jenkins, attracted his attention as he was watering his rose bushes. Ethan waved a hand to welcome a notion developing in his mind. "Good morning, Mr. Jenkins," Ethan yelled out, walking closer to the gate that split the two estates. Mr. Jenkins searched against the bright morning. "Ethan, how are you today?" "I'm doing fine, thank you, Ethan."
He paused for a.
"Just before I started, I was wondering whether Mrs. Robinson had seen." Lately, Mr. Jenkins scowled his aged face, considering came to think of it. "I haven't seen Jane in quite some time. Used to see her hobbling about in her garden virtually every day." But he trailed off, seeming uncomfortable. Ethan felt a knot in his stomach. "How long would you estimate it takes?" "At least a few weeks ago," Mr. Jenkins answered, his voice laced with worry. Everything was good. Ethan forced a smile, not wanting. "Thank you for your help. I'm sure it's okay. Just miss her," to alert the neighbor unnecessarily. Jenkins, as Ethan returned to his van, thought recalled the neighbor's words a few weeks without anyone witnessing. Mrs. Robinson felt uneasy as she was often outside and active in. Her unexpected disappearance felt like a disturbance in the usual flow of life on this planet. Getting into his vehicle, Ethan paused for a time, his palm resting on the steering wheel as sought to reason through. Mrs. Robinson might have been visiting relatives, or maybe had been indoors and under the weather. But the overflowing mailbox, messy yard, and now neighbors' validation of her long absence all led to something more severe. When he turned on the engine and moved away from the curb, Darius could not. Mrs. Robinson's absence nagged at him, a constant anxiety that had crept over him. Shake the uneasy feeling that had settled over him. Halfway down his path, he turned to look back at her house in the rearview mirror. Back of mind, anticipating her familiar friend to show up on the porch, the home stayed quiet and remained, windows gloomy and uninviting. As Ethan rounded the bend and Mrs. Robinson felt he was leaving something vital as his street vanished from view. Despite the day ahead of him loaded with more deliveries and daily chores, but his mind stayed with returning to the old woman. As noon drew near and his planned lunch break arrived, Ethan discovered himself dragging his regular lunch spot's familiar neon sign into Mabel's diner's parking lot, flickering weakly in the brilliant daylight, a lighthouse of comfort, food, and kind faces. Usually this lunch break was a pleasant respite bite from his rounds, a time to refresh and refocus. Today, although his stomach's knot of concern had only tightened as the morning went on. As he opened the diner entrance, the bell above jingled excitedly. Unlike his gloomy attitude, the smell of coffee and grilled sandwiches permeated the air, yet for once it failed to stir his appetite. "Ethan," Mabel yelled from behind the counter, round face furrowed in a kind smile. The regular Ethan nodded, absenteously sliding onto his usual stool at the counter. "Thanks, Mabel." Mabel was rushing off to get ready. Ethan's mind returned to Mrs. Robinson. The picture of her overflowing mailbox continued flickering in his head, a mute testament to her protracted absence. He couldn't get rid of the terrible sensation. Incorrect when Mabel presented him a warm turkey club sandwich with side of crispy chips. Ethan hardly observed he picked at the food, his mind revisiting every element of his trip to Mrs. Robinson's house. Mrs. Robinson has long been a mainstay in the area. Her presence finds comfortable as the rising sun. Ethan Recalled many mornings illuminated by her kind smile and sincere curiosity about his life, she had a method of making him felt and valued even in the fleeting seconds of their contacts. The time last. Winter, when she had insisted on delivering him a thermos of hot chocolate on a particularly cold day, or the spring. Morning, when she had boldly given him her just blossom roses, her face lit with joy. These little deeds, these moments of human connection, had always been the high point of his life. Now, the idea of her alone and maybe in trouble gnawed him. What if she had fallen and unable to call?
She was sick.
For aid, the alternatives in his mind, each more upsetting than the. Ethan pushed his still full plate away, his hunger totally gone, and saw Mabel asking her while staring at him with concern, "Everything all okay, honey?" Ethan sighed, running a hand over your food. Voice soft you have hardly touched. His visage worries me. One of the neighbors on my path admitted, Mrs. Robinson over Elm Street.
Have you?
Seen lately? Mabel's brow wrinkled in contemplation. Now that you bring this up, I haven't seen Jane Robinson at her regular Tuesday lunch with the church ladies in some time. Is something wrong? The validation of Mrs. Robinson's prolonged absence from yet another source only heightened Ethan's discomfort. He briefly told Mabel, whose gaze grew more worried as he told, "Oh my," Mabel whispered when he finished. That sounds really unlike Jane. She has always been quite involved with the community. Ethan nodded, experiencing a mix of validation and more anxiety. I know I can't help but feel as though I ought to act, but I'm not sure. Mabel reached across the bar. She stroked his palm. You have a nice heart, Ethan. If you follow your intuition, suspect something's awry. Most likely. Ethan departed Mabel's diner. Words repeated in his head, the weight of duty squarely on his shoulders. He knew he could not simply keep his path as though nothing is amiss. Mrs. Robinson has always treated him with respect, and he owed her at least the effort of ensuring she was kept warm. All right, getting back into Ethan's postal truck made a decision he couldn't have. Good conscience would ignore his instinct anymore. He would return to Mrs. Robinson's residence and check on her. Once more, he would not leave until he was positive she was secure. Turning the key in the ignition, Ethan experienced a mixture of anxiety and resolve, not knowing what Mrs. Tom THPS might discover. Son's residence, but he had to test the afternoon sun's long shadows. Mrs. Robinson's front yard looked like this as Ethan drew up to the curb for the second time that day. Significantly more desolate in the strong light, its abandoned state more obvious than it had been in the milder morning. Ethan left his van, his heart racing somewhat quicker than usual. With deliberate steps meant to find answers this time, he reached the front door. He raised his hand to ring the doorbell and observed something he had missed earlier. A faint bad smell. Perched on the porch, he pressed the doorbell, its chime hanging in the air, resounding through the house exactly like it did that morning, but this time following a period of tense quiet. He heard something. The slow shuffling sound of footsteps approaching the door relieved him. Ethan swiftly followed with a fresh sense of worry why Mrs. Robinson hadn't responded before. What had Ethan changed? The door creaked open. Felt his breath stop in his throat. The woman facing him had little in common with the Mrs. Robinson he knew. Her usually clean silver hair was messy and greasy. Her face was thin and pale, yet her eyes really startled Ethan. They were unfocused and glassy, devoid of the warmth and intelligence. He was familiar with Mrs. Robinson, Ethan said quietly. Ethan, your mailman, is here, attempting to keep the shock out of his voice. Mrs. Robinson blinked slowly, looking to have difficulties focusing on Ethan. She whispered, a faint, raspy voice. Sure, I'm good, but just a bit under the weather. Ethan saw with increasing dismay the condition of her clothes. Her house dress was wrinkled and dirty, and her slacks in the private area had concerning red marks. The scent, stronger now, mixed unclean bodies with something sickly delicious that he had observed previously. Couldn't quite identify Mrs. Robinson, Ethan said softly, fighting to keep his voice calm. I am rather worried about you. You do not seem very good at all. Is there someone I could ask? Mrs. Robinson waved a shaking family members or doctor's call. Hand dismissively, no. I'm rather all right, I simply need some rest." She staggered on her feet, Ethan. All her words blurred together somewhat. Reflexively grabbed to stabilize her, she flinched away from his hand as the door opened wider, giving Ethan access to the houses inside. What he saw caused his blood to run. The once immaculate living room was in complete chaos, rubbish. Scattered the floor, empty food containers, crumpled papers, and what seemed shockingly like old medical supplies. The furniture was covered with dust, and the air within was heavy and... "Still, Mrs. Robinson," Ethan remarked, his voice now anxious. "Kindly let me assist you. This is not right. You need me to say I'm good." Mrs. Robinson burst with sudden fire in her. She started to close the voice. "Thanks you for your concern. I can manage on my own with that." Ethan stood there shocked and conflicted, the glimpse he had seen of the inside of the house and Mrs. Robinson's worrisome look Ward had in line with his respect of her privacy and wishes as the door closed, stayed anchored to the location. The weight of what he had seen, the sound of the lock engaging from within snapped firmly on his shoulders. Ethan, out of his daze, retreated, his head racing. Mrs. Robinson, he knew, would never have lived in such circumstances. Something was quite wrong, and her discount of his worries just served to accentuate. Every step he took on his way back to his van felt more weight than the last. Picture of Mrs. Robinson's weak body, the upsetting marks on her clothes, and the anarchy inside her house played on. Keep in his mind the striking difference between this reality and the vivid. Shaken and unsure, he had known a decent woman. Ethan slipped inside his van, but instead sat there, hands clutching the steering wheel as he struggled with what he had witnessed and what he ought to do given his sense of responsibility. Mrs. Robinson ran against his uncertainty about crossing limits inside the mail system. Van felt choked while Ethan sat there, his mind whirl of contradicting ideas and feelings. The weight of the choice before him dropped on his shoulders, making every breath feel worked and insufficient. On one hand, Mrs. Robinson had clearly informed him she was fine and didn't require assistance. She was an adult able of making her own judgments. Who was he? Merely a mailman? Questioning that, or meddling in her affairs? The professional side of him claimed that he had already exceeded expectations by visiting her twice. Maybe he should honor her desires and leave her alone. The picture of her thin face, the alarming marks on her clothes, and the disorganized state of her house kept coming back to him. Mrs. Robinson, he knew, would never have let her house or herself to descend into such a state. Something was obviously terribly incorrect. Ethan closed his eyes and tried to center himself, considering all the times Mrs. Robinson had welcomed him warmly. She had always treated him with respect and kindness. So he remembered the day she had given him a Christmas
She grinned,
card appreciating his consistent performance and kind approach. She had observed him as more than just the mailman. She had considered him as someone from her community. Could he truly turn his back on her now, when she so obviously clearly needed aid, even if she couldn't or wouldn't acknowledge it? Taking a deep breath, Ethan made his decision. He couldn't leave things as they were, even if he was oversteering, even if Mrs. Robinson became offended with him. He had to try once more, owing her that much. Ethan got out of the van and, this time with deliberate steps, returned to Mrs. Robinson's front door. Ringing. He waited, counting the seconds. The silence the doorbell produced seemed even more sinister. In his mind, before ringing once more, Mrs. Robinson cried out, his voice with a note of desperation. "Ethan, once more. I only want to ensure you're all right." The silence lasted, just disturbed by the distant sound of a lawnmower and kids playing farther down the street. The usual for these sounds felt strange in comparison to the developing. Ethan felt a great sense of anxiety as he tried knocking the sound of his fist against the wood resounding in the peaceful afternoon. "Mrs. Robinson, if you can hear, please open the door. I am anxious about you." The minutes passed with no. Ethan sensed his nervousness in Spike, who had been there just seconds previously.
Why
wasn't she responding now? Had something happened to her in the brief period since he had last seen her? The possibilities tore over his brain, more frightening than the last. Had she fallen unconscious? The red marks he had noticed on her clothes suddenly became more menacing. What if she was bleeding and needed quick medical attention? Ethan moved away from the his pulse thumping. He realized he had to act, yet he lacked the permission to enter. He was not family, her house, but he also couldn't get rid of the idea that if he left right now, something horrible may happen. With shaky hands, Ethan pulled out his phone and stared at it for a long time. His palm hanging over the keypad, making this call may transform everything. It could be an overreaction, a violation of Mrs. Robinson's confidence and privacy, but it might also be the thing that rescued her. Breathing deeply to calm himself, Ethan dialed 9911 as the phone started to ring silently. Hoping he was doing morally, the dispatcher's voice came through cool and professional. 911. Ethan choked hard, then started to say his words hurriedly, driven by hurry and concern. My name is. As a mailman, Ethan Harris worries greatly about one of the people living on his route. Her name is Mrs. Robinson. Jane resides at 1247 Elm Street. I visited her house twice today, and something seems somewhat unusual. Wrong. As Ethan shared what he had seen, Mrs. Robinson's messy yard, overflowing mailbox. Messy looked the stains on her clothes, the condition of her house, and now her lack of response at the door caused a mixture of relief and anxiety. That he was at last acting actively to assist Mrs. Robinson, and concern about what the repercussions would be of this call. Ethan was reassured by the operator that they would send cops to carry out welfare operations right away, considering the gravity of the matter, particularly with relation to the stains. Ethan noted they would also send an ambulance, since Mrs. Robinson most certainly needed medical attention. As Ethan hung his call off, his deep, trembling breath revealed no returning now. He had started events beyond of his influence. All he could do now is wait, and hope he had chosen wisely. Ethan settled in to wait for the authorities to show his thoughts full of questions over what would happen next, and whether his acts will finally either bless or harm this sweet elderly woman who had always made his day joyful with her soft smiles and gentle words. The wail of sirens pierced the still afternoon air, getting louder as they neared Mrs. Robinson Street. Heart pounding, Darius got up from where he had been seated on the curb as a police cruiser and an ambulance passed by. Rounded the turn, lights ablaze as the cars drew in. Ethan felt a mixture of relief and nervousness. Outside of Mrs. Robinson's house started this, and now two police officers were leaving the station without turning back. Cruiser, their expressions serious as they neared Ethan. You are the one who phoned this in. The taller of the two instructed Ethan to swallow firmly, gruff but not nasty. For this route, Mr. Ethan Harris is the postmaster. I called regarding Mrs. Robinson. The policeman nodded and pulled out a paper. Could you specifically describe what you saw that caused you enough concern? Ethan inhaled deeply and related all he had seen to contact 911. From Mrs. Robinson's concerning appearance and the state of her inbox, to the overflowing mailbox and messy yard. He could see the officer's expressions become more worried as he spoke. You say you spoke to her earlier, but now she is not responding to the second officer inquired. Ethan nodded. Yes, that is exactly she. Maybe 20 minutes before I phoned you. She insisted she was all right, but she obviously wasn't now. She is not reacting at all. The cops looked at one another, then turned to Mrs. Robinson's house. All right, we will check it out. You stay here, first officer advised. Ethan watched as the cops walked up to the main door. His stomach was churning with a mixture of anxiety and the hope that the taller police rang the doorbell after his buddy positioned himself on the right side. He had done the right thing. Side hand lying on his holster as a safety measure for lengthy stretches devoid of responding. From within the house, the cops knocked loudly, introducing themselves as police, and asked Mrs. Robinson would answer the door if she could hear them. The hush that followed was deafening. After several more tries to get a response, the police conferred momentarily, their looks grave then too. Ethan's disbelief caused them to start to arrange themselves for a forced home entrance. He called out, unable to stop yourself. Are you sure that's required? The second officer turned to. Based on what you have told us and the facts, he his face empathetic but firm, sir. Lack of reaction calls for us to act in welfare since Mrs. Robinson might be in urgent danger. Check and, should it be necessary, Ethan nodded back, then entered the grounds. His pulse hammering as the police got ready to break down the door. The sound of splintering wood as they drove it open seemed to resound across the peaceful community as the police vanished. Ethan held his breath into the home, and the following 3 minutes seemed like a lifetime as he waited, anxious to hear any sound from inside. Then there was an abrupt flurry of activity requiring emergency aid. One of the cops yelled from within the house. The paramedics who had been there also yelling here, now screaming. Waiting beside the ambulance, they hurried by Ethan's medical bags in hand and vanished inside the house. The scene before him felt strange, like something out of a TV thriller rather than the peaceful street he was familiar. Darius stood there anchored to the and as more voices joined the ruckus within the house, he could hear calls for urgent directions. The rustle of tools being transported under it all, a little groan he knew to be Mrs. Robinson's voice. Weight of events hit Ethan all at once. His choice to seek for aid had set all of this in. Something he had been right to be worried about, but as he proceeded, the actuality of the matter was far more severe than he had anticipated. Observed the frantic action in and around Mrs. Robinson's house, Ethan had a range of contradictory feelings. Relief that aid had come, remorse for not acting sooner, and a deep, goring concern over what exactly they had found. Inside Mrs. Robinson's house, the chaos appeared to go on for an eternity. Ethan stood anchored to the ground, his postal uniform made uncomfortable. Tight as fear tightened his chest, the once quiet street had become a hive of activity, with neighbors peering out of windows and some courageous people exploring their front lawns to have a closer view of the developing drama. At last, following what seemed like hours, but most likely only minutes, one of the police officers came out from the house. Grim looked at Ethan. "Sir," the officer started, his voice quiet and serious. "I would want to probe Mrs. Robinson a few more about when she last saw her before." Ethan must have swallowed hard today in order to remember it. Must have been around 2 weeks ago. "She generally welcomes me a little more when I deliver the mail, but I hadn't seen her in a while, therefore part of the reason I was so concerned today." The officer nodded, scribbling down notes. "And in your past contacts, she never mentioned any health problems, any friends or family members who visit her?" Ethan shook his head, a knot developing in his stomach. "She never mentioned any major health issues. And I know little about her personal life. She lives alone as far as I can tell." As they spoke, the front door opened once more, and the paramedics appeared. Seeing Mrs. Robinson lie there looking tiny and directing a stretcher, Ethan's breath froze in his throat. Nestled beneath the blankets and straps and 4-bag hung from a rod connected to the stretcher, and an oxygen mask covered most of her face, landed on Ethan like a physical blow. Mrs. Robinson, the woman who had always smiled at him, had told tales of her garden and inquired about her day, now seemed so delicate, almost as though she could completely vanish. Mrs. Robinson was gently placed by paramedics into the ambulance. Ethan went back to the cop, his voice barely above. The officer sighed, running a hand, whispering what transpired in there. "From what we know, Mr. Harris looks to be a cancer sufferer. Through his hair, it's not good. Evidence of cancer treatments in the house, drugs, medical equipment, that sort of stuff. She's somewhat dehydrated and emaciated. What's confusing, it seems she was at home in this state rather being in a hospital. This begs questions. At a point when she requires continuous medical attention." Ethan felt his knees weaken, but she stated she was well, though, and that individuals in her situation typically try to answer the door early. Disguise how terrible things are. The officer kindly explained: pride, dread, uncertainty. There could be several reasons why you trusted your instincts and contacted us. You could very well have kept her life intact. The statements, meant to be comforting, only made the struggle in Ethan's head more intense. If he had acted earlier, had he have observed something was off weeks ago, these ideas whirled in his mind and could have been stopped. Ethan's head turned to see something more being pulled from the house, and 4 stand like the one of the paramedics assigned to Mrs. Robinson's stretcher carried out this task. Seeing Ethan's disoriented expression, the officer clarified that Mrs. Robinson appeared to be trying to take care of herself at home. Medical equipment is housed inside. Though we don't know the whole story yet, it appears she may have been released from a hospital. Prescriptions lately, and left to handle on her own. The ramifications of this hit Ethan strongly. While life in the neighborhood had gone on, Mrs. Robinson had been suffering alone and unable to adequately take care of herself. On as usual around her. How had he not sensed anything was so desperately awful? Wrong as Ethan felt a wave of wool cutting through the locked ambulance doors and the car ready to leave. Driven by shock and shame, he turned to the officer, his voice now more forceful. "Which hospital are they visiting? I would like to check on her if that is permitted." The officer gave him a little approving nod. "You have gone above and beyond already, Mr. Harris." But Mrs. Harris is confident. "You are traveling to Mercy General." As the ambulance drove away, Robinson would have valued a familiar face. Sirens. Ethan stood there till the weight of the events of the day settled around the corner. Wailing Ethan. Mostly on his shoulders, but along with it he developed resolution, having started this by depending on his intuition. He now felt driven to carry it through to ensure Mrs. Robinson wouldn't have to confront. Whatever came next, Ethan took a long breath and headed back to his mailed truck. His path was not complete, but for once the man would have to wait. He had somewhere far more. Crucially, Mercy General Hospital's fluorescent lights create a strong glow across everything, adding to the already antiseptic surroundings seem even more clinical. And Ethan, in the waiting room, his postal uniform rumbled, sat in an uncomfortable plastic chair impersonally. From the long day his head spins with concern and unresolved questions. Questions he had arrived at the hospital soon after the ambulance had flown across his whole route in record time. The staff had been hesitant to provide him any information at first, since he wasn't family had taken some time to explain, and the lucky arrival of one of the paramedics on scene to serve as a vouch for him before he was let to remain. Hours had gone by, and Ethan watched, hoping for word. Every time the doors to the hospital opened, physicians and nurses rushed by, their faces fixed in expressions of professional worry. Emergency room opened. He sat up straight, expecting for word concerning Mrs. At last, a doctor in scrubs came up to Mr. Harris and inquired. Ethan sprang up fast, his heart rushing. "Yep, that's me. How will Mrs. Robinson be?"
Consulting a clipboard.
"All right." The doctor's expression was solemn as she waved Ethan back down.
She
sat next to him. Her voice was quiet and deliberate. "Mr. Harris, I want you to know that the person who discovered Mrs. Robinson and phoned for aid most likely saved her life." Still, Ethan felt his throat constrict. Her condition is still really severe. "How bad is it?" the doctor asked, sighing over her choice of words. "Mrs. Robinson is meticulously malnourished and severely dehydrated.
She
also has cancer that has grown greatly. We are acting as best we can, but her age and the degree of her illness render her prognosis dubious." The words hit Ethan like a physical blow. He had knew things were terrible, but hearing it presented clinically made it all the more real. "I don't know," he said, his voice almost above a whisper. "How could things get this bad?" Nobody knew she needed. From what we have been able to piece out, aid. The doctor's countenance softened somewhat from what Mrs. Robinson was lately discharged from another hospital, expected to have home care, but she trailed off her irritation. Clearly, patients fall through the system's gaps, particularly in relation to aging. Patients without family to speak for them. Ethan experienced a flash of wrath coupled with, though that's not exactly correct, there must be something in place to stop this kind of thing from happening. "You're exactly there." The doctor agreed with her in tone and found sympathetic. Sadly, though, the truth is usually far from perfect. Overworked, understaffed hospitals, social workers, insurance issues, everything adds up. More often than any of us would want to acknowledge, these kinds of circumstances arise when the doctor is still explaining. Ethan's mind drifted as Mrs. Robinson's illness and the treatment schedule caught him.
He considered all the times.
Over the past few weeks, he had sent letters to Mrs. Robinson's house, never recognizing the crisis developing. Though the shame was intense behind that closed door, it was soon being eclipsed by a developing sensation of, "I could see." Ethan questioned, abruptly interrupting the doctor's middle. She seemed determined. The doctor hesitated. Right now she is quite drugged and visiting hours almost ended. Yet she stopped, looking at Ethan's face. Something in his expression must have caught her attention. "I guess I should mention, we can make an exception for Ethan. who tracked the doctor across. He stole the meandering hospital hallways he could see for what might be nothing, but could have completely. Ready him for the sight of Mrs. Robinson in her hospital bed, the energetic, kind-hearted woman he knew was barely. From every point of her weak body, identifiable tubes and cables seemed to grow out. The mechanical symphony produced by the constant beep of monitors and oxygen's hiss felt incompatible with the quiet dignity. Mrs. Robinson had always been Ethan's hesitant approach to the bed, his eyes stinging with unshed tears. He softly grabbed Mrs. Robinson's hand, cautious not to disturb any of the medical apparatus. Her skin felt paper. "Mrs. Robinson, I'm sorry," thin and chilly to the touch. His voice choked with emotion. "I should have sensed something was wrong sooner and acted accordingly." More while Ethan stood at Mrs. Robinson's bedside, consumed in guilt and ideas. Mrs. Robinson's fingers twitched slightly, and his eyes followed her eyelids flutter. DAR's heart jumped into his throat as Mrs. Robinson gradually came to. He replied, gently slinking closer, "Ethan, your mailman is in the hospital you're in." Secure. Her eyes opened completely, then momentarily confused till recognition dawned. Dawning Ethan, she couched, her voice faint and raspy. What? Ethan clicked the call button for the nurse, then turned back to Mrs. Robinson. She had been rather sick. "Robinson, but right now the physicians are treating you well," the medical staff hurried in to check on their newly aware patient Darius. He retreated, a mixture of relief and worry enveloping him when after completing their tests, doctors reassured Mrs. Robinson she was stable enough for a brief chat. Ethan returned to her bed and said, "Your voice is a bit stronger now. Tell me you're the one." Ethan felt his cheeks warm with "Your saving of my life." Embarrassed Mrs. Robinson, "I followed everyone's advice. I was afraid about." "Not everyone." Mrs. Robinson shook her head slightly and wore a sorrowful grin. "Would have seen Precious. Not everyone would have cared." She stopped, breathing unsteadily. "I apologize for my outburst before. I guess I owe you an apology for the entire circumstances. I was just ashamed about." Mrs. Robinson explained throughout the next hour between water breaks and stops to collect her breath. Stories. She had been diagnosed with cancer several months before. The harsh therapy had left her frail and unwell, although she had battled hard to surpass the sickness. "I believed I was healing," she stated. Her eyes were far off with memories. "But then they informed me that my insurance wouldn't pay any additional inpatient treatment I received from the busy hospital." Ethan listened, his heart heavy, as Mrs. Robinson detailed her discharge. He was going home. Days passed, and no one showed up from the previous hospital. She had been advised a home care nurse would check on her. Unable to adequately take care of herself, embarrassed to seek assistance, she had gradually degraded. "I wanted not to be a burden," she muttered, tears shining in her eyes. "I have always taken care of. Though I felt I could control. Everything was getting out of hand." "Worse, what about your family, buddy?" Ethan's subdued smile. Mrs. Robinson was tinged with melancholy. "Gone, dear. Harold departed years ago, and most of my friends have either never had children at all or just passed on or find similar circumstances to mine. I didn't want to disturb everyone's own issues." "You are familiar with D.I.S. felt a lump developing in his throat. Mrs. Robinson almost struggled alone, too arrogant or humiliated to ask for aid. Mrs. Robinson added, "Unbearable. You are not a burden. You should never have been left alone like that." "It is not." "Right." Mrs. Robinson gently squeezed his hand. "The world isn't always right, sweetie. However, having people like you in it gives me hope." Since Ethan and Mrs. Robinson sat in comfort, ably silence absorbing the weight of their discourse, a little knock on the door disturbed their ideas. The doctor who had spoken with Ethan earlier arrived in the room carrying a clipboard and a carefully calibrated Mrs. Robinson. The doctor had a hopeful look on his face. He started, his voice professional but friendly. "If you're feeling up to discussing your treatment plan going forward." Mrs. Robinson nodded automatically, reaching for Ethan's. He gave it a comforting squeeze while the doctor delivered the encouraging news. "Despite the recent setback we think of as inevitable, if you're ready for more therapy, the cancer hasn't advanced. You have a great chance of recovery. As much as we first worried, and with intensive treatment, we are hopeful about your Mrs. Robinson saw a ray of hope, but it was soon eclipsed by concern the doctor raised. Seeing her nervousness change uneasily, she turned to face the elephant in the room. "Still, I should talk about the financial side of this course of treatment." He said, his tone started to get more cautious considering the degree of treatment you might require. "Must inquire about your insurance situation. This is an expensive therapy, and we should not worry about that, Ethan." Interrupted, his voice strong and resolved, Mrs. Robinson and the doctor. Both looked to him, startled by his abrupt announcement. Ethan kept his look solid and decisive. "Find out what insurance covers and whether I should help with any extra expenses. I know for sure that every neighbor in the entire community would be more than happy to assist." Two, he turned to Mrs. Robinson. His softening eyes let you avoid facing this. "Mrs. Robinson, alone today we will assist you through this process." The doctor's face cracked into a relieved smile. He nodded, clearly influenced by Ethan's dedication. "That's fantastic. That will definitely simplify things. I'll let you two alone now to go over everything. Later on, when you've had some rest, we can go over the specifics of the treatment schedule tomorrow." Mrs. Robinson looked to Ethan, her eyes glistening with tears. "Robinson," as the doctor left the room, "I don't know what to say. Your donation is too great. I cannot possibly." "Mrs. Robinson, accept you can, and you will," Ethan replied softly, but firmly. "Has always been friendly to every neighbor. Now it's our turn to be there for." Mrs. Robinson's tears poured over her, speech choked with feeling. "You are an angel, Ethan. Really makes me wonder why folks like you exist in our world. How can I ever pay such kindness?" Darris smiled, patting her hand. "You don't have to return anything, just. We only want that they sat in companionable. Our emphasis is on growing better." Stillness for a moment before Mrs. Robinson spoke once again, her voice somewhat changed. "It's odd, isn't it, how our casual conversations during postal delivery have resulted in this time I never would have?" Though Ethan answered carefully, "Imagine life has a tendency of shocking us. What community is about is not only being there for one another in large scale, but also..." Little he leaned in his voice, full of affection, "and what we are about to. Mrs. Robinson, you are not fighting cancer alone. We will be with you every stage of this battle." Mrs. Robinson nodded, a tiny but real smile over her face. She felt a real sense of hope for the first time in months. Although the path ahead would be challenging, she wouldn't have to walk it alone while Ethan's hospital room window lets in evening light. Mrs. Robinson kept speaking, planning, and sharing anecdotes. The small act of asking a neighbor had evolved into a great monument to the force of compassion and the ongoing power of community. At that instant, Ethan and Mrs. Robinson understood that whatever difficulties lay ahead, they would tackle them together, and in doing so they had not just transformed each other's life, but had set an example of what it really means to be a neighbor, a friend, and a member of something more than others, not oneself. Disclaimer: this channel stands against all forms of intolerance, discrimination, racism, and violations of human rights. The stories shared here are original creations, developed to encourage reflection, understanding, and constructive dialogue. All content is produced with a commitment to respecting diversity and honoring human dignity.